Thank you, Tom, and all for being here today. I certainly speak as an Arab, having worked on peace and reform issues in my country and in the Arab world, and a strong believer in both. And I also speak as an analyst, being with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Now, I do not speak as an Arab official, of course, because I no longer am, although my views are certainly shaped by the experiences that I had in the Arab world for the last 20 years. I want to start with the premise that the rising up of people demanding freedom, dignity, social justice, and government accountability across the Arab world is, to me, a positive development. It put the Arab world back on the right course of history. But that does not mean that there is not a long road ahead. The fitful, messy, and unpredictable process of self-government and democratic institution building is just beginning. And it would be wrong to judge the process by what has transpired in the last 2 years. This process is one that will necessarily unfold through decades, not through months and years. Taking place under banners of democracy and freedom, these Arab revolutions fulfilled the long-stated U.S. goal of moving the Middle East toward greater democratic and representative government. And so the United States cannot turn its back on this process now. Washington has a stake in the outcome of the political jockeying unleashed by the Arab awakening and must stay engaged as the people of the Middle East struggle to take control of this moment. But I think we need to realize that U.S. policy in this new environment will be more complicated and demand more time, effort, and patience than when pro-American leaders sat in Tunis, Cairo, and Sana'a, or when Baathists had a firm grip in Damascus. The relative predictability of the old order, for good or ill, is gone. Fluidity now rules the day, both for the countries in transition and for those that have not started a transition yet. We also need to realize that the Obama administration's ability to influence events will be limited, often, by a number of factors, including reduced economic resources, limits to military power, as we have seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, domestic fatigue with military involvement, and Arab frustration with long-time U.S. support for the status quo and failure to advance the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Nevertheless, America has an important role to play. Those who doubt the relative significance of American leadership need only look at the recent cases of Libya and Syria, where the decisive factor for action or inaction has been the extent to which the United States chose to engage. And so the states in the midst of transition, in my opinion, will still need U.S. encouragement, understanding, tough honesty, and where appropriate, economic assistance to build new institutions that support pluralism, foster respect for minority and individual rights and international law, marginalize the voices of extremism and sectarianism, and put their people on a path to greater prosperity. The states that have not yet moved toward reform also need the United States to bluntly assess the consequences of their actions and to encourage them to embrace change. I have a number of suggestions for U.S. policy in the new Obama administration. I have no way of telling whether the U.S. will embrace them or not, but as an analyst, I can afford the luxury of only suggesting. First, focus on performance, not ideology. The commitment to democracy is fundamentally correct, and the United States should make it clear that it will always support the ability of the people of the Middle East to choose their own governments and hold them accountable. The United States should stick to a disciplined policy approach, though, that emphasizes the primacy of adherence to international standards, including respect for treaty obligations, individual and minority rights, and peaceful rotation of power. The losers in the initial political competitions will, in some cases, be all too ready to raise questions about the validity of the process or the desirability of democracy, to cover their own shortcomings or frustrations. The Obama administration cannot let the naysayers or the extremists, either in the region or in the United States, hijack the narrative of the moment. As Secretary of State Clinton said, one election does not a democracy make. That's just the beginning of the hard work. The United States should make it clear that it is in for the long run. U.S. criticism or praise of countries of the region should be based on performance and should be applied to newly transitioning countries as well as traditional friends, but should not be based on ideology. The second suggestion is to set realistic expectations. The Obama administration's policy must be guided by realism and pragmatism as it engages with new actors in the Arab world. You're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do in the Middle East. Washington's ability to influence events will be marginal in many areas. Political transition on the ground will largely be driven by domestic events and considerations and the competition for vote, power, and resources. Whenever possible, though, the United States should focus on institutions, not individuals as it did in the past, as this is where democratic processes will be implemented, or not. In President Obama's second term, the administration should re-energize efforts to build constructive working relationships at the institutional level and forge partnerships around practical endeavors to advance effective governance and inclusive economic development. U.S. involvement and engagement should also help Arab countries develop and finance their own civil society and political parties, a task Arab capital is certainly capable of. But while U.S. support for local non-governmental institutions has been successful, it is important that these organizations nurture and develop deep roots in their local communities to be credible and sustainable. And finally, the administration should be extremely cautious about imposing political conditionality on aid, trade, debt relief, and other support. Seeking to use aid as leverage often backfires. And in the fragile political atmosphere that currently prevails in these countries, such attempts are likely to provoke a strong nationalistic reaction and do more to undermine U.S. long-term goals than to advance them. The third suggestion would be not to try to pick winners and losers. The United States should avoid taking sides before the electorate has registered its decision at the polls. For the foreseeable future, Islamist parties will likely dominate politics in most of the countries in transition, and other parties. And movements will have to work harder to gain traction in the new political environment. Initially, the political playing field in many of these countries will display a tendency to develop around familiar communal, religious, and tribal banners. Real party building will likely take decades in the Arab world. Along the way, the U.S. should be available to advise all nonviolent groups on electoral practices and democratic processes. Moderates will inevitably be challenged by extremists in the new public domain, as has been the case in Egypt and Tunisia, for example. But the primary U.S. goal in this area should not be to become part of the internal political narrative. Visible U.S. efforts to encourage liberal movements to organize and build stronger grassroots support are likely only to hurt these groups. The best way to support the goal of sustainable democratic change is by clearly committing to the principles and processes of democracy, accepting and dealing with all legitimate winners of elections, and insisting at the same time on the need for continuing the electoral process into the future. The fourth suggestion is to recognize that political Islam is neither monolithic nor static. The entry of Islamist actors into the political process in transitioning countries holds the greatest promise for the evolution and moderation of political Islam. For the most extreme Salafi groups, political participation presents a major ideological threat. But for others that are in power today in Egypt, in Tunisia, partly in Morocco, all offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, governing will require new pragmatism and difficult choices. The dynamic is likely to differ from country to country, but the United States must be ready to challenge new Islamic governments and emerging Islamist groups across the region to strengthen and institutionalize the democratic processes that brought them to power. In its dealings with the Islamists, the United States should also be attuned to emerging generational and ideological splits within these movements. Even among the region's Salafis, there is evidence of important divisions between groups engaged in social and political activism and those that espouse violence. The United States should avoid viewing all groups through the same lens. The new Arab order has to be based on principles of political, cultural, and religious pluralism if this Arab awakening is to succeed. If Islamists are going to lead the way for now, they will need to embrace these values. It is too early to tell if this is in the cards, but it is too early to assume that it will not be. The United States and the international community should work together to help show the way. Fifth is to break the regional deadlock on Syria. The Syrian regime has so far been able to postpone defeat that I believe is inescapable. Assad has been aided in this effort by deep divisions among the opposition and the heightened regional struggle between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar on the one hand, and Iran on the other over outcomes in Syria. To date, U.S. policymakers, we must recognize, have faced few good options. Since the start of the revolution, the risks presented by greater U.S. military engagement, greater loss of life, further militarization of the conflict, and empowerment of military elements within the opposition over civilian and non-violent ones have outweighed the potential benefits. However, this calculus may be beginning to shift. The key will be, in my view, progress made in efforts to promote greater unity and inclusiveness among the Syrian internal and external opposition. It is too early to tell whether the recent events in Doha and the new Syrian unified opposition will advance this role. But in the final analysis, any political settlement in Syria will require the support of Syria's neighbors in order to be sustained. There are some indications that the ongoing fighting and threat of an enduring military standoff has begun to shift regional attitudes towards a political settlement. Turkey, a staunch supporter of the military overthrow of the Assad regime, wavered initially on short revolution, along the lines of Egypt and Tunisia. But the increasing threat of spillover into Turkey has shifted Ankara's assessment of the risks and costs of the continued conflict and signs that there may be increased interest in diplomatic action to end the fighting. The Obama administration should engage in aggressive diplomatic activity in support of a negotiated settlement to the conflict that places Syria on a track for political transition and eventual elections and institution building. And therefore, U.S. outreach to Moscow, as well as to the other regional players, should focus on breaking the international and regional deadlock and gaining support for a transition that will remove Assad, because I don't think he can any longer claim legitimacy, end the fighting on the ground, and prevent the breakup of the state. This will necessarily require a formula that takes into account the need to assure the main minorities in Syria, the Alawites, the Kurds, and the Christians, that they have a future in the country. Without this element, a post-Assad Syria will remain a serious destabilizing factor in the region, where growing sectarian conflict in neighboring states will present an increased threat to regional stability. On Iran, I would suggest that the United States stay the course on Iran. I think more or less it has been implementing the right policy. The Arab awakening in many ways represents a strong challenge and setback for Iran. Iran, in my view, is one of the biggest losers of the Arab awakening. Its model of governance has been proved to be totally deficient. Its support for the Assad regime has resulted in its loss of public support in the Arab world, dramatic loss of public support after that support reached its zenith probably about 3 years ago. The Obama administration is likely to face new obstacles and decisions about when and how to support Iran's internal opposition over the next 4 years. But in the second term, President Obama should continue to resist political pressure to embrace democracy activists publicly, because doing so would undermine the credibility of their cause at home. I think the United States should also use its leverage with Gulf states to promote regional goals. Since the fall of the Shah of Iran, U.S. objectives in the Persian Gulf or Arab Gulf have remained largely unchanged: ensuring security and stability, maintaining the free flow of oil and gas to international markets, and using American military assets to counterbalance Iran and keep the Gulf of Hormuz open. These efforts serve both the United States and regional states that are concerned about Iranian influence and intentions. However, the Arab awakening has added a new dimension to U.S. relations with Gulf states by underscoring the high cost of friendly states' failure to take the need for internal reform seriously. The failure represents a direct threat to long-term U.S. interests and security and stability in the Gulf. Significant reform in the Gulf states is critical to stave off further polarization and inevitable unrest. The Obama administration cannot afford to sugar this point with Gulf Arab monarchies. And finally, a word on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm going to probably, as somebody who has worked at peace between Israel and Arab states for 20 years, put it even more dramatically. And I agree with all the comments of my predecessors, but I'll even put it more dramatically than they have. The choice for the Obama administration today is peace now or never. And I don't use my words lightly. More than 5 years have passed without any substantive direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The situation has led to deepening paralysis and almost complete deadlock. The Palestinian Authority, which has aggressively pursued economic state-building projects and security cooperation with Israel in recent years, faces near certain demise, both politically and economically. And Israel, for its part, must deal with a looming demographic time bomb of existential proportions. The number of people, of Arabs living in areas under Israel's control today is equal to the number of Jews. 6 million Arabs and 6 million Jews today live in areas under Israel's control. The demographic bomb is no longer something that is going to happen in the future. The time for peace is now. Each month that goes by makes the problems more difficult to address. Time and experience have shown that the stars will never be aligned to make Israel-Palestinian peace easy. And if we are waiting for a better time to come when all the stars will be aligned, I'm afraid that that time will never arrive. The Obama administration needs to accept that to wait for such a moment is to intentionally defer action forever. Those who choose to subscribe to this view, and there are many in this town, arguing that the time is not ripe for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, that neither the Palestinian nor the Israeli governments are ready, that we better wait for a better time when the dust settles on the Arab awakening. Those who choose to subscribe to this view must do so with eyes wide open, acknowledging the consequences both for Palestinian rights and aspirations, but also for the long-term existence of Israel as a democratic state. Years of failed effort have demonstrated, as Bill has also said, that it is useless to talk about launching another process on the way to settlement. Process is no longer sufficient. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, it has become no more than a synonym for delay and inaction, for creating new facts on the grounds with settlement activity that make securing a two-state solution impossible. There is no substitute for an active and engaged U.S. role in this area. The United States must commit itself to work through the quartet to bring about a speedy settlement of the conflict before it is too late. This means engaging Arab players such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt, and securing an understanding about the basic parameters of a comprehensive settlement, something which is not that difficult to do. But the goal should be to establish a timetable of months, not years, to iron out the details that in large part are already very familiar to all those involved. Making peace in the Middle East is not cost-free, but it is vital to U.S. national interests, because the absence of a two-state solution will have very serious repercussions, not just for Palestinians, but for the long-term future of Israel and the long-term stability of the region. The choice today on this issue is between the difficulty of achieving peace today and the impossibility of achieving it tomorrow. And the administration has to choose. Thank you very much.